The park was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that makes every sound seem sharper. Birds were chirping from the trees, and the gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh grass. An old man named Harold walked slowly along the path, carrying a small paper bag in his hand. His steps were careful, but steady, as if he had made this walk many times before. There was nothing hurried about him. He looked like a man who had all the time in the world. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were calm and gentle. When Harold reached the familiar bench under the big oak tree, he lowered himself down with a sigh, not of sadness, but of comfort. This was his spot, the place he came to every morning. He opened the bag and took out a few crumbs of bread. Almost instantly, pigeons began to gather around his feet, cooing and fluttering their wings. Some brave ones hopped close, waiting for him to toss the food. Harold smiled faintly and scattered the crumbs, watching the little birds fight and fuss over them. It was not just about feeding the pigeons. For Harold, this moment was about peace. His wife used to sit beside him here, years ago. She loved the birds more than he did, laughing softly whenever one dared to peck food from her palm. After she passed away, Harold kept coming, almost as though he could still feel her presence on the bench next to him. The world kept moving fast around him, new cars, new buildings, people rushing everywhere but here. In the park, time slowed down. Children's laughter echoed from a playground not too far away. A mother pushed her baby stroller past him, nodding politely. A jogger ran by, headphones in his ears, not noticing Harold at all. None of it bothered the old man. He liked being invisible here, just another part of the park like the trees or the grass. He sat quietly, leaning back, watching the world carry on. Every crumb he tossed into the dirt felt like a small ritual. The pigeons trusted him by now. They knew him. Every day he gave them a reason to gather, and every day they gave him company. Sometimes he talked to them softly, calling them by little names only he knew. It was silly, perhaps, but it made him smile. He wasn't lonely when the birds were around. As the sun climbed higher, the light filtered through the branches above, making shifting patterns on the ground. Harold squinted up at the sky, letting the warmth touch his face. His old hands trembled slightly when he reached for another piece of bread, but he didn't mind. He had grown used to his body's weakness. What mattered was the peace in his heart. Other people might have seen only an elderly man sitting idly, doing nothing important. But to Harold, this hour in the park was the most important part of his day. It was his connection to memory, to nature, to life itself. He didn't need anything more than the bench, the birds, and the quiet rhythm of the morning. Sometimes he thought of his younger days working long hours. Raising children, always busy, always rushing. Back then, he never imagined he would cherish such stillness. Life had taught him the value of slowing down. Now, he could sit for an hour and watch ants crawl over the dirt or notice how the wind bent the grass. These small details, unnoticed by most, were treasures to him. The pigeons fluttered their wings, startling when a dog barked in the distance. Harold chuckled softly, amused by their nervousness. He reached into the bag and spread the last crumbs with care, as if he were hosting a grand feast. The birds clucked and pecked eagerly, circling his feet like little dancers. He leaned back, resting his tired shoulders against the bench. For a moment, he closed his eyes and imagined his wife's voice beside him, saying, "You spoil them." Too much, Harold. It was not a sad thought. It was a warm one, like a memory wrapped in sunlight. The park around him carried on. Cars could be heard faintly from a distance, a reminder of the busy city beyond the trees. But here, on this bench, Harold was in a world of his own making. Peaceful, gentle, untouched by hurry. He was not waiting for anything to happen. He was simply living the moment in the simplest, purest way. And so, Harold sat there. The pigeons. At his feet, the sunlight on his face, and the memory of love beside him. To anyone else, it was just an old man in a park. But for Harold, it was life itself, quiet, steady, and full of meaning. Asterisk Officer Daniels spotted the old man as soon as he turned into the park path. From a distance, Harold looked harmless just. Another elderly figure hunched over on a bench, tossing crumbs to pigeons. But to Daniels, who was only 2 years into the force and eager to prove himself, there was no such thing as harmless. His training had taught him that idleness sometimes hid trouble. A man sitting too long in one place might be doing more than feeding birds. Daniels adjusted his cap and quickened his stride, his boots tapping firmly against the gravel path. He carried himself with authority, shoulders straight, chest puffed slightly. In his mind, every walk through the park was a patrol, every passerby a potential case, and every pause an opportunity to show he was in control. As he neared the bench, his eyes narrowed. The old man's clothes were simple, even a little worn, and his shoes had clearly seen better days. Daniel's thoughts immediately leapt to assumptions. Loitering, homeless, maybe waiting for someone up to no good. He convinced himself that he was seeing signs others missed. That made him feel sharp, important, like a real officer of the law, not just a rookie filling out parking tickets. Sir Daniels called out, his voice louder than necessary. It cut through the gentle sounds of birds and rustling leaves, turning a peaceful morning into something colder. Harold looked up slowly, squinting at the young man in uniform. Yes. Harold's voice was calm, steady, the tone of someone who didn't expect trouble. Daniels stopped in front of the bench, feet planted wide, hands resting on his belt. Do you have any identification on you? Harold blinked, a little surprised at the request. Identification? For sitting? His voice carried a touch of disbelief, though he remained polite. This is public property, sir, Daniels replied. Quickly, the words almost rehearsed. And people can't just sit around all day without purpose. I need to know who you are and what you're doing here. Harold looked at the pigeons still pecking around his shoes, then back up at the officer. His face showed no anger, only mild confusion. I'm just feeding the birds, that's all. Daniels didn't budge. In fact, he stepped closer, his shadow falling across Harold. Feeding birds isn't a reason to be here for hours at a time. We've had complaints about suspicious behavior. People sitting around, staring, making others uncomfortable. Do you understand? The old man gave a small sigh, the kind that comes from years of patience. Young man, I've sat here every morning for years. This bench, this spot. I've never made anyone uncomfortable. I'm no danger to anyone. But Daniels wasn't satisfied. His chest tightened with the urge to press harder. Something about the old man's calm demeanor irritated him, almost as if Harold was challenging his authority by not showing fear. Daniels wanted compliance, quick and unquestioned. That was how respect was earned, he thought. You'll need to show me some ID, Daniels repeated, his voice firm now. Bordering on harsh, Harold slowly reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out an old wallet. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from age. He handed over a worn driver's license. Daniels examined it longer than necessary, as though searching for a hidden clue. Nothing. Just a name, Harold Thompson, and an address not far from the park. Daniels handed it back reluctantly. Mr. Thompson, I'll remind you, this park isn't your living room. People come here for recreation, not to watch strangers sitting around for hours. Harold tucked the license away, his eyes fixed on the young man with quiet dignity. This isn't about rules, is it? This is about you wanting to feel important. The words hit Daniels harder than expected. He bristled, jaw tightening. Watch your tone, sir. I'm just doing my duty. Around them, life in the park went On a young couple pushing a stroller slowed their pace, glancing curiously at the scene, but not stopping. A jogger circled back, earbuds pulled out just enough to hear what was happening. People noticed, but no one interfered. Daniels liked. That audience, even a small one, gave him more reason to assert control. Duty. Harold repeated softly, shaking his head. Once upon a time, duty meant protecting, not bullying. Daniels felt heat rising in his cheeks. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone old enough to be his grandfather. He straightened his posture even more. I could write you a citation for loitering. I could call in backup and have you removed. Don't test me. Harold didn't flinch. He just leaned back against the bench, his calmness like a stone in the river of Daniel's anger. Do what you think you must, he said simply. I've lived too long to be afraid of paper and ink. The pigeons fluttered suddenly as Daniels shifted closer, their wings slapping the air like nervous applause. The young officer's hand hovered near his notepad, ready to make good on his threat. To him, this wasn't just about Harold anymore. It was about proving he had control of the situation, showing everyone watching that he wasn't soft, that he wasn't a rookie to be dismissed. But what Daniels didn't realize, in that moment of swelling pride, was that someone else was watching. To someone standing just behind him, silent but keen, dash-eyed Dot. And soon, that silence would break. Harold sat quietly for a moment after the officer's words, as if weighing them in his mind. The pigeons at his feet continued pecking at crumbs, completely unaware of the invisible battle happening above them. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like an ordinary scene. An old man on a bench, a policeman standing over him. But inside Harold's chest, something stirred a mixture of sadness, patience, and a touch of weariness. He looked up at Officer Daniels with steady eyes. Eyes that had seen wars end, cities change, and children grow into adults with families of their own. He was not easily shaken, not by raised voices, not by uniforms. Instead of snapping back or showing fear, Harold's lips curled into a faint smile, almost too small to notice. "Young man," he began slowly, his voice deep, but gentle, like an old violin, "you want to know why I sit here? You think I'm wasting time causing trouble, but let me tell you something." Daniels crossed his arms, shifting impatiently, but Harold did not rush. His words carried the rhythm of someone who had learned that stories need time. "My wife. And I used to come here every morning. For 40 years, this bench has been ours. We'd bring a little bag of bread just like this, and feed these birds. She loved and laughed every time one was brave enough to land on her hand. When she passed away, I thought maybe I'd stop coming. It hurt too much at first. The silence on this bench was heavier than I could bear. But then I realized something." He paused, glancing at the pigeons as if they were part of the story too. "If I stopped coming, I'd be letting go of her memory. Sitting here isn't about loitering. It's about holding on to the woman I loved. It's about remembering the sound of her laughter in the mornings, the way she'd tell me I was scattering too many crumbs." His voice trembled slightly at that last line, but his gaze remained firm. People walking by slowed down, their ears catching pieces of his words. Something about the old man's tone demanded attention, though he wasn't speaking loudly. He didn't need volume. He had weight. Daniel shifted on his feet, uncomfortable. He hadn't expected a story. He hadn't expected emotion. He wanted compliance, not confession. But Harold wasn't finished. "You talk about purpose, officer. You say I need a reason to sit here. Well, love is a reason. Memory is a reason. Peace is a reason. Not every man who sits alone is lost. Sometimes he is sitting with the people he carries in his heart." The officer's jaw tightened, but Harold could see something flicker in his eyes. Something human, something uncertain. Daniels quickly masked it, straightening again. But the old man knew he had touched something deeper. Harold leaned back on the bench, his hands folded on his lap now, the bag of crumbs nearly empty. His voice grew softer, but no less steady. I've lived long enough to know that rules matter, but kindness matters more. The world is already loud, already rushing, already cruel in so many ways. If an old man sitting on a bench feeding birds is the worst thing happening in this park today, maybe this world isn't so bad after all. For a brief moment, silence fell between them. The pigeons fluttered their wings, filling the gap. Daniels looked down at the man, struggling to find words. He wanted to maintain his authority, but something about Harold's calmness unsettled him. The old man wasn't resisting. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't even pleading. He was simply reminding him of something he had forgotten. Behind them, young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, why's the policeman bothering that grandpa?" The mother hushed him, pulling him along quickly. But the words hung in the air, echoing louder than intended. Harold heard them. He smiled faintly. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't angry. He simply looked back at Daniels and said, "You see, sometimes children notice the truth faster than grown men do." The officer's face flushed. He clenched his notepad, then loosened his grip again. Harold's patience, his willingness to speak without fear, had shifted the air around them. What had started as an interrogation was turning into something else, a lesson. Though Daniels didn't want to admit it, Harold reached into the bag one last time, scattering the final crumbs. The birds swarmed eagerly, their wings brushing against his shoes. "There," he said softly, almost to himself. "They'll eat and fly off, just like we all do. Come, go, and leave behind only the memory of our time here." Then he looked back at Daniels with the quiet power of someone who has nothing left to prove. "So if you want to write your citation, write it. If you want to call for backup, call. But remember this, officer, one day you'll be old too. And maybe you'll find yourself sitting somewhere, remembering someone you loved. When that day comes, I hope no one looks at you and says, 'You have no purpose here,' because you will. We all do." The words lingered in the air, softer than a shout, but sharper than any command. Daniels swallowed hard, realizing the man before him was not a suspect. Not a case, but a teacher in disguise, teaching without anger. Teaching without even trying. And from the path just a few steps behind them, another listener. Figure with far more authority than Daniels was already deciding what this lesson meant. Daniels stood stiffly, his jaw hard, his pride stung. The old man's words had slipped under his armor in a way he wasn't prepared for. They didn't sound like defiance, but they made him feel exposed, like a boy scolded in front of the class. And Daniels hated that feeling more than anything. He pulled out his notepad with a sharp flick, the small paper pad looking like a weapon in his hand. The pigeons scattered at the sudden movement, their wings thrashing the air in a storm of feathers. Harold simply watched them fly, his expression calm, as though the birds' panic belonged only to the young officer. "All right," Daniels said, his voice louder now, carrying into the open space of the park. "You've chosen not to cooperate. So I'll write you up. Citation for loitering. That'll teach you this bench isn't yours." His words came out clipped, fast, as if the louder and quicker he spoke, the more in control he would sound. Harold did not flinch. He folded his thin hands neatly on his lap, his eyes fixed on Daniels with something that wasn't fear, it was almost pity. "If writing on paper makes you feel bigger," Harold said softly, "then write. But remember, ink fades faster than memory." Daniels felt his face heat, the pen in his hand trembling slightly, though he gripped it hard. He began scribbling furiously on the page, the scratch of the pen loud in the morning quiet. A small group of onlookers had begun to gather nothing. Large, just scattered people, pausing mid-walk, sensing the tension. A jogger slowed to a walk, tugging out one earbud. A mother with her toddler stopped, the child pointing curiously at the officer and the old man. "Sir, don't make this harder than it has to be," Daniels barked, though it was clear the only resistance was his own pride. "You think you can sit here and ignore orders? You're mistaken." Harold tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile at the edge of his lips. His voice, though quiet, carried enough to reach the small cluster of people now watching. "I'm not ignoring you, officer. I'm simply not afraid of you. That's different." A ripple of whispers moved through the onlookers. Daniels heard them, and his chest grew tighter. He couldn't lose face now, not in front of witnesses. He jabbed the pen harder against the paper, his writing messy, impatient. "This is official," he snapped. "You'll answer for this." Harold leaned back, his shoulders resting against the bench, as if he were settling deeper into comfort, rather than being pressed under authority. "I've already answered," he said, quietly. "With my life, with my years. With the people I've loved. That's the only record that matters." The words sank heavy in the air, making Daniel's scribbling sound childish in comparison. He could feel the stares of strangers on his back. He imagined what they were thinking young. Cop bullying an old man. The thought made him furious, and so he pressed harder, determined to finish the citation. His pride demanded it. But the harder he pushed, the clearer it became. The old man wasn't the one losing ground here. Harold sat like a stone and the stream end moved, unbroken. While Daniels fumed and sputtered around him like rushing water, stand up. Daniels suddenly ordered, snapping his notepad shut. The sudden command startled even himself. "On your feet, sir. If you don't want to cooperate here, I'll escort you out personally." Harold turned his head, slow and deliberate, looking up at the officer with weary eyes. "Escort me? Where?" "Away from the birds, away from the sun." "You think I need chains to feel trapped? You already sound like chains, officer. Every word of yours rattles like iron." The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder. A teenage boy pulled out his phone, raising it as if to record. Daniel's stomach lurched when he noticed, but his anger was quicker than his caution. "Put that away," he barked at the boy, who flinched but didn't lower the phone completely. Now the scene felt heavier. The small audience grew bolder. In their whispers, the jogger muttered something to his friend. The mother shook her head quietly, guiding her child a few steps farther, but not leaving entirely. Eyes were fixed on the young officer. Daniel's pulse raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be in control. He was supposed to give an order, and the old man was supposed to obey. That was the simple equation drilled into him at the academy. Order plus obedience equals authority. But Harold had broken the equation without even raising his voice. Daniels reached for his radio, his hand brushing against it as if calling for backup might restore balance. But before he could press the button, Harold spoke again, his words carrying like a soft bell through the tense air. "Young man, do you know what power really is? It's not the ability to make someone afraid. It's the ability to make someone respect you without trying. Fear fades. Respect stays. Which do you think you'll be remembered for?" Daniels froze, his hand hovering uselessly at his side. He felt every set of eyes watching, weighing him, silently judging. His throat tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. And then before he could gather his footing, before he could strike back, the silence behind him shifted. Someone had stepped closer, someone whose presence carried more authority than his voice ever could. Daniels didn't know it yet, but the moment was about to tip. The watcher was ready to reveal himself. For a long moment, Daniels didn't notice anything behind him. His focus was pinned on Harold, On the notepad in his hand, on the murmurs of strangers that felt like needles against his skin. But what Daniels didn't realize was that another presence had been there the whole time, steady, patient, and unseen. Chief Inspector Reynolds had entered the park minutes earlier, choosing the long gravel path instead of the busier entrance. He often walked through the park quietly when he wanted to see his officers in action without them knowing. A real glimpse, he believed, came when no one thought they were being observed. And today, by chance or fate, he had found himself witnessing something far more telling than routine patrol. Reynolds was not a young man, though he carried his age differently from Harold. His uniform was sharp, his back straight, his eyes the kind that seemed to read more than what was spoken. He had served decades on the force, seen both noble acts and disgraceful ones. He knew the line between protecting the public and abusing power, and he had come to believe it was one of the thinnest lines a man could walk. At first, he had stayed back, watching silently as Daniels confronted the old man. He had hoped his officer would see reason, that the sharpness in Daniels' tone would soften once he realized he was speaking to nothing more than an elderly man with crumbs and pigeons. But instead, Reynolds saw the opposite. A rookie's pride puffing itself up, turning small words into threats, letting ego steer the wheel where judgment should have. He had almost stepped in sooner. But Reynolds was a man who believed in letting rope run out sometimes long enough to see whether it would bind or break. And Daniels, with every snapped word, with every scribbled note on his pad, was wrapping the rope tighter around himself. Now the moment was ripening. The crowd, small but growing, had changed the air in the park. It was no longer just a quarrel. On a bench, it was a spectacle. Phones were being raised, whispers exchanged, eyes widening at the imbalance between the young officer's authority and the old man's calm defiance. Reynolds knew that left unchecked, this could sour into something far uglier. He stepped closer, his shoes making almost no sound on the gravel. The pigeons that had fluttered away earlier returned to the edges of the scene, as if even they sensed the shift in the air. Daniel still hadn't noticed. He was too busy fumbling with his authority, clinging to the notepad in his hand as though it were proof of his control. He muttered to himself, scribbling nonsense lines, unsure of what to write but desperate to look in charge. The people watching weren't fooled. They saw an officer unraveling. Then came Harold's soft, measured words again. Fear fades. Respect stays. Which do you think you'll be remembered for? Reynolds stopped just a step behind Daniels, his presence like a tall shadow cast across the young officer's back. He didn't speak yet. He let the silence stretch, let Daniels stew under the invisible weight pressing in from behind. A few onlookers noticed him, their eyes widening in recognition of the higher-ranking uniform. They said nothing, but their shifting expressions hinted that the balance was about to change. Daniels sensed something, finally. A faint prickle along the back of his neck, a heaviness in the air that wasn't there before. He stiffened, the way a child stiffens when he knows his father has walked into the room unannounced. He didn't turn immediately, but his pen faltered in his hand. "Go on," Harold said gently, as if reading the moment. "Write what you must, but understand someone is always watching." The words struck Daniels deeper than he could admit, because for the first time he realized they weren't just metaphor. They were literal. He spun halfway around, and there he was, Chief Inspector Reynolds, standing tall, arms behind his back, his expression carved in stone. Daniel's throat went dry. His heart dropped to his stomach. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He snapped to a stiff posture, standing at attention, as though good posture alone could erase what had just happened. Reynolds didn't move at first. His silence was heavier than any shout could have been. His eyes flicked once at the notepad, once at Harold, then returned to Daniels. It was enough to say everything without a word. The crowd grew quieter, sensing the shift. Phones lowered, whispers hushed. This wasn't just an argument now. This was judgment. When Reynolds finally spoke, his voice was calm, even, but carried through the air with the weight of steel. "Is this what public service looks like to you, Officer Daniels?" The words didn't need to be loud. They landed harder than any yell could. Daniels' face drained of color. His hand twitched at his side, the notepad trembling as though it wanted to leap from his fingers and vanish. Reynolds took a single step closer, his gaze never wavering. The silence after his question stretched like a blade. Daniels opened his mouth again, trying to explain, trying to defend, but the truth was written across the old man's calmness and the crowd's accusing eyes. There was no defense left, and Harold, sitting quietly with the sun warming his shoulders, knew the scales had tipped. The watcher had arrived, and the lesson was only beginning. Daniels stood frozen, his pen limp in his hand, his pulse hammering. In his ears, the words from Chief Inspector Reynolds still echoed. "Is this what public service looks like to you?" They weren't shouted, but they carried more weight than a courtroom gavel. The park had grown quiet. Even the pigeons seemed to pause in their scratching, tilting their little heads as though curious about the human drama. The small crowd that had gathered held its breath, sensing they were about to witness something important, not just a scolding, but a reckoning. Reynolds stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel path. He didn't need to raise his voice because silence followed him like a cloak. His eyes, sharp gray and seasoned by decades on the force, locked onto Daniels with a calm intensity that was more frightening than anger. "Explain yourself," Reynolds said finally. His voice was measured like a teacher calling on a student who hadn't studied. Daniels straightened even more, chest puffed, trying desperately to summon the authority that had been stripped from him moments earlier. "Sir, this man was loitering, sitting here for hours, feeding pigeons. I was questioning him too." Reynolds cut him off with a single curt gesture of his hand. "Loitering?" He repeated the word slowly, letting it hang in the air. "You believe an old man seated on a bench, feeding birds in broad daylight, is a threat worthy of your time? Of the department's time?" Daniels swallowed, his mouth dry. "Sir, we've had complaints." Reynolds' eyebrows rose. His tone grew sharper, though still controlled. "And you believe the best use of your badge was to target a 70-year-old man with breadcrumbs in his pocket. Tell me, officer, do you think the pigeons filed the complaint?" A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd. Daniel's face burned. His lips tightened, but he didn't dare speak again. Reynolds turned his gaze toward Harold, who sat quietly, hands folded in his lap. His calmness hadn't shifted, not once. His eyes met Reynolds without fear, without need for explanation. That silence spoke volumes. Reynolds nodded once, then returned his attention to Daniels. "Do you know who this man is?" Daniels blinked. "Sir, he's just. Reynolds' tone hardened, slicing through the word. "This man has been part of this community longer than you've been alive. He and his late wife used to sit on this very bench. I know because I've seen them myself. When I was a younger officer walking these rounds, I'd pass by and see the two of them laughing, scattering crumbs, reminding us that parks are not only for exercise but for living. He is no stranger here. He is the history of this place. And you," Reynolds jabbed a finger lightly but firmly toward Daniels, "treated him like a criminal." The weight of the words crushed Daniels' last shred of confidence. His pen slipped from his hand, dropping onto the gravel with a soft, humiliating thud. The crowd shifted, murmurs running through them like a current. Some nodded in quiet approval of Reynolds' words. A boy with his phone lowered it slightly, no longer interested in capturing a young officer's arrogance, but in the lesson being delivered instead. Reynolds stepped even closer, his presence towering. His voice grew low, but every syllable landed like a hammer. A badge is not a weapon for your ego. It is a promise to serve, to protect, to uphold dignity. And what have you done here? You've embarrassed the uniform. You've embarrassed yourself. Most of all, you've embarrassed the very idea of justice. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that he was only following duty. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had not acted out of duty. He had acted out of pride. And now, in front of witnesses, in front of his superior, that pride was shattered. Reynolds turned slightly, gesturing toward Harold. Look at him. Did he shout at you? Did he resist? Did he raise a hand? No. He gave you patience, stories, wisdom, and you answered with threats. That is not strength, officer. That is weakness. The words sank into Daniel's like stones. In water, his chest rose and fell quickly, each breath heavier than the last. Apologize. Reynolds commanded simply. The order struck harder than any reprimand. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. His pride twisted like a knot in his chest, choking him. The crowd waited, expectant. Harold remained still, his expression unreadable but calm, like a man who had seen storms come and go. Now, Reynolds said, his voice sharp enough to cut. Daniel's shoulders sagged. His head bowed slightly, his voice cracking as he forced out the words, I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. Harold looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod, his eyes kind but steady. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply received the apology like a man who understood that forgiveness carried more weight than punishment. Reynolds let the silence linger, letting the apology sink into the air for everyone present. Then he said firmly, remember this moment. Officer, one day when the uniform feels heavy on your shoulders, think back to this bench. Remember that strength is not measured in how loud you shout, but in how gently you can stand. Daniels nodded stiffly, his face pale, his pride stripped bare. He felt smaller than he ever had before. But deep in his chest, something stirred a lesson carved painfully but permanently into him. And Harold, sitting quietly, knew the storm had finally passed. The tension in the park had begun to soften. Daniels stood awkwardly, his apology still fresh in the air, while the crowd's murmurs faded into silence. For a moment, it seemed the scene might simply end there, with the rookie embarrassed, the old man vindicated, and the chief inspector's words hanging like a lesson in the morning air. But Reynolds didn't step away. Instead, he turned, lowering himself onto the bench beside Harold. The crowd shifted in surprise, officer of his rank, choosing to sit beside the very man his subordinate had tried to shame. The action alone spoke louder than any reprimand. Reynolds rested his hands on his knees, glancing at Harold with something rare in his eyes. Not authority, not command, but respect. It's been a while, Reynolds said quietly. Harold looked at him with faint curiosity. Then recognition dawned. You're Inspector Reynolds, aren't you? The chief nodded slowly. Yes, though I wasn't a chief back then. Just a young officer walking this park on early shifts. And you, Mr. Thompson, you were here then too. Not alone, though. You were always with her. Harold's face softened. His eyes glistened at the memory. Eleanor, he whispered. My wife. Reynolds gave a small smile, almost nostalgic. That's right. I remember the two of you. She had that laugh light, like bells. I'd pass by and hear it before I even saw you. You'd both be feeding these pigeons, same as today. I never stopped to bother you. Didn't need to. Some things don't disturb peace, they create it. The two of you created it. The old man's throat tightened, but he smiled too, though it carried sadness beneath. You remember her laugh, Harold said softly, more to himself than to Reynolds. That means a part of her is still here, not gone completely. The inspector nodded, his gaze far away for a moment. I remember how she used to tease you for scattering too much bread. Said you'd have the whole city of pigeons marching behind you one day. Harold chuckled faintly. The sound cracked but warm. She did say that. Every morning. I'd do it on purpose just to hear her laugh. His voice trailed into silence, and for a moment the two men sat side by side. Lost in memory, two men bound by the same woman's presence. One through love, the other through observation. Daniel stood a few steps away, watching in confusion. He had no idea his superior carried such history with this old man. The rookie had seen Harold as nothing but a nuisance, a suspect to be handled. Yet here was the chief, speaking to him like an old friend, lowering the weight of his authority. In respect to someone who had simply lived quietly, the small crowd leaned closer, drawn into the intimacy of the moment. The park itself seemed to hush, the trees holding their leaves still, the breeze softer, as if the world itself recognized the sacredness of what was unfolding. Reynolds finally turned back to Daniels. His tone was calm, but there was iron beneath. Do you see now? This isn't just some old man sitting alone. This is a man who has given this park its spirit. He and his wife made this bench part of its story. You saw only what you wanted to see, an inconvenience, a problem to be solved. But if you had looked closer, you might have seen what I see, a piece of history. A piece of love still alive in these mornings. Daniels lowered his gaze, shame burning deeper. He felt smaller now than ever, as though he had been blind in a room full of light. Harold turned to him then, his voice gentle. It's easy to miss, son. When you're young, you think everything important is loud, fast, urgent. But life's treasures hide in quiet places, like this bench, like laughter, like memories of someone you loved. The words didn't come with anger or bitterness. They came like a gift, as if Harold wanted the young officer to carry them forward. Reynolds placed a hand lightly on Harold's shoulder. This man has given more to this community than you realize, Daniels. Sometimes service isn't about action, but about presence. His presence here is service Tory, minding us of patience, of love, of time well spent. Never mistake stillness for weakness. The inspector's voice, steady and reverent, wrapped around everyone listening. The lesson was no longer just for Daniels, it was for all of them. Even the crowd stood quieter, their expressions softened, as though the truth had seeped into their hearts as well. Harold looked at Reynolds, gratitude in his tired eyes. You honor her memory, Chief, more than you know. Reynolds gave a small nod. No, Harold, she honors us still. Through you. The pigeons flapped again at Harold's feet, circling as if to punctuate the moment. Daniel stood motionless, staring at the old man, realizing for the first time that authority didn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wore wrinkles, carried stories, and spoke softly, but carried more weight than law itself. And in that moment, Harold was no longer just an old man on a bench. He was the keeper of memory, the heartbeat of the park, and the quiet teacher no one expected but everyone needed. The morning sun had risen higher, washing the park in golden light. What had started as a tense scene now felt softer, gentler, as though the park itself understood a lesson was being taught. The small crowd lingered, unwilling to leave, sensing that what was unfolding was more than just an argument resolved. It was something they might remember for years. Daniel stood stiffly, still red with shame. His apology had left his lips earlier, but it had felt thin, brittle, like a shell with nothing inside. He shifted on his feet, hands clenched at his sides, wishing the ground would swallow him whole. In his mind, the moment replayed again, and again, the way Harold's calm had unraveled his authority. The way Reynolds' words had pierced deeper than any reprimand at the academy ever had. And then Harold moved. Slowly, carefully, the old man straightened his back and turned his full attention toward the young officer. His eyes, though lined with age, carried a brightness, not of anger, not of pride, but of something Daniels wasn't used to seeing. "Compassion, officer," Harold said softly, his voice like a steady stream over stones. "You've spoken your apology. Now, let me give you mine." Daniels blinked in confusion. "Why your apology?" Harold nodded gently. "Yes, I'm sorry, because men of my age sometimes forget how hard it is to be young. You carry weight you don't yet know how to balance. You want respect, but you're not sure how to earn it. That makes you restless, makes you chase it in the wrong ways. I understand that. I was young once too." The words struck Daniels harder than any reprimand. He had expected scorn, maybe cold silence, but not this. Not understanding. Not forgiveness. Harold went on, his voice steady and warm. "I've lived long enough to know anger doesn't heal. Forgiveness does. You thought I was in your way. But really, I was here to remind you. Strength isn't in how tightly you grip your authority, but in how gently you use it." The crowd fell completely silent. Even the boy with the phone lowered it now, realizing this wasn't something meant. For the internet, it was meant for hearts. Daniels felt his throat tighten, his chest heavy with something unfamiliar. He swallowed hard, forcing out words. I don't deserve your forgiveness, sir." Harold gave a faint smile, almost like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Maybe not today, but you will. If you remember this moment, you will." Reynolds, still standing tall, nodded in approval. His voice was firm, but less sharp now. "Mr. Thompson is right. You won't forget this morning, Daniels. You'll carry it with you, and when the time comes, you'll understand why it mattered. The badge will feel different on your chest from this day forward." Daniels bowed his head, his voice low. "Yes, sir." Harold leaned back on the bench, letting out a slow breath. His bag of crumbs was empty now, and the pigeons, fed and satisfied, began to scatter into the sky. Their wings beat upward in unison. A sudden burst of motion that seemed almost symbolic, like the air itself was being cleared. The sunlight caught on their feathers, turning them into little flashes of silver against the blue. The crowd, sensing the moment had reached its end, began to drift away. Some whispered quietly, others simply looked thoughtful, touched by what they had witnessed. A few nodded respectfully at Harold as they passed, as if acknowledging the quiet dignity of the man on the bench. Reynolds placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder before turning back to Harold. "Thank you, Harold. It's not just for your patience today, but for the years you've given this place. The park would be less without you." Harold smiled faintly, his eyes misting. "And I'd be less without it." Reynolds gave a final nod, then began to guide Daniels away, speaking low in his ear, the way a mentor does to a student who has much yet to learn. Daniels glanced back once, his eyes meeting Harold's. There was no bitterness in them now, only a deep, uneasy respect, the kind that comes when pride has been stripped bare and replaced with humility. Harold remained seated, watching the officer and the chief walk down the path until they disappeared around the bend. The park was quiet again. The pigeons had flown. Sun was warm on his face. For a long moment, he simply sat there, his hand resting gently on the wooden bench beside him, the space where Eleanor once sat, and then, almost as if speaking to her, he whispered, "We taught them something today, didn't we?" A breeze stirred, rustling the leaves above, and Harold closed his eyes, letting it wash over him like an answer. The lesson had been given. The day had moved forward. and though the park would fill with new footsteps and new laughter as the hours passed. The memory of this morning of a proud young officer humbled, of an old man's quiet strength, of forgiveness offered instead, of anger would linger, carved into the silence of the oak-shaded bench. For Harold, it was just another morning. For Daniels, it was the morning he would never forget.